Here we go.
Thank you all for coming. I'm here today to talk to you about No Child Left Behind, and the title of my speech is No Child Left Behind, Good Idea, Bad Execution. So for the last 8 years, an experiment has been going on in our schools. No Child Left Behind, instituted in 2002, is meant to force schools and teachers to take accountability for education. What it actually ended up meaning is that schools and teachers are responsible for students' test scores, a different thing from education. The experiment has failed, and in many ways, schools are worse off than they were before the act passed. It's time to take back education. No Child Left Behind creates basic standards of education that apply to all schools receiving Title I funding, or 58% of all public schools. And it is intended to bring nearly 100% of students up to grade level competency by 2014. Acceptable yearly progress is a standard for each school, for each year, for each group of students. And the percentage of test scores that need to be at grade level is determined by the state. But it has to increase by a certain amount every year so that they meet 100% competency by 2014. So progress is measured by standardized testing for each grade, K through 12. And it includes also that disadvantaged groups, minorities, people with disabilities, people who have English as a second language, and low-income students all have to meet these standards, as well as the general student populace. Consequences for not meeting an acceptable yearly progress include sanctions, requiring tutoring, reorganization, or shutting down a school. No Child Left Behind fails to improve education because it puts the entire responsibility of education on teachers and schools, because it rewards schools for teaching to tests rather than achieving competencies, and it requires students to match a one-size-fits-all standard. So No Child Left Behind puts the responsibility for education entirely on teachers and schools, and it fails to provide teachers and schools with the tools that they need to succeed, to pass AYP, and continue to receive funding. It's in putting all the responsibility on the teachers and the schools, it fails to acknowledge the responsibility that students have. You can't force a person to learn. And a student's responsibility is to come to school prepared to put in time and effort, to put time and effort in outside of class, and to have the expectation that they'll do the best that they can. They need to put that in. Teachers can't force students to learn. They can't force them to understand things. So putting all the onus on the teachers in the schools ignores that responsibility, and it kind of makes students feel like they aren't responsible for their own education. Also, families have a responsibility to provide time and quiet space for learning, to set an expectation for success, and to provide the opportunity for assistance, either by themselves or some other person. Even the teacher, to ask the teacher for help if they think their child is suffering. But most of all, to set the expectation that the child needs to succeed as well as they can. So sanctions for not meeting AYP fall directly on teachers and schools. They do not fall on students. That fails to acknowledge the roles and responsibilities involved. Teachers are reporting high stress and low morale in schools due to the pressure to improve scores, and so are students. All of them feel that they have that expectation, but they don't have the tools that they need to reach the goals that are set. And schools themselves don't have the tools to reach the requirements. No Child Left Behind was never fully funded. And if AYP isn't met, additional requirements, such as teachers spending additional time with students, both in class and before and after school, strain the resources that the schools have, because they aren't always provided sufficient additional funding to make up that extra time. 100% proficiency is not perceived as achievable, and this is a widespread perception. Both school administrators and teachers and lawyers who are currently pursuing cases against No Child Left Behind, that 100% proficiency, given the wide variety of students that they have in schools, simply isn't achievable by 2014. So knowing that they can't necessarily reach that goal, unfortunately schools often game the system. They use, and states as well, they use underhanded methods that aren't necessarily, don't present a true picture of what's happening in order to try to retain funding. For instance, states will pick their own assessments, and when you compare students' scores on state assessments with national assessments, you see that assessments are increasingly less rigorous. Students will do better on the state assessments, but they'll continue to do poorly on the national assessments. And this gives you the idea that the state assessment is less difficult and maybe doesn't show quite as well how the students are doing. States also set their own confidence variance levels, which is like saying margin of error. So if a school needs to reach 30% competency, but they only have 20%, but the margin of error is 10%, that means they met the goal. And these confidence intervals aren't based on proper research tools, they're just set by the state. So, and then we've also heard news stories that teachers in schools have actually changed scores, have actually outright cheated in order to try to make these goals. And in a way you say that obviously isn't right, but they have so much pressure on them to try to meet goals that they don't think they can meet. No Child Left Behind fails to provide schools with tools that they need to achieve the standards set, but there are also some problems with the standards themselves. No Child Left Behind rewards schools for teaching to the test, rather than teaching to comprehension. Achievement in No Child Left Behind is measured by standardized testing, but standardized testing doesn't show higher level learning. It focuses more on memorization of facts. Basically, you're testing how well kids can listen and spit back the information that you told them. And a lot of times teachers are encouraged to teach to the test, to teach what they know is going to be on the test and the method that the test is given. So the students will do well on the test, but that doesn't give all the students the information they need to actually do well in the subject, to understand the subject. So teachers will spend lots of time preparing for multiple choice tests, memorization, rather than on context or on other subjects. And schools are reducing or eliminating social studies, art, science, music, and physical education in favor of reading and math, which are subjects that are tested under No Child Left Behind. This deprives students of personally relevant, creative, and well-rounded curricula. It focuses on the subjects that are tested, and it leaves the context out. And some students may need that context in order to really understand the topics. So, in other words, No Child Left Behind causes schools to remove context, which some students need in order to understand the material, leaving a one-size-fits-all educational curriculum remaining. So, No Child Left Behind requires all students to fit that One Child Left Behind standard in order to succeed. Children will develop at different rates, and different children develop differently, such as children with disabilities, or children who have had insufficient prior schooling, or children who have English as a second language, and so it's a language barrier. But No Child Left Behind requires all of them to be at grade level at each year in order to pass AYP. Disabled children, in particular, may learn at their own speed in their own way and need to be accommodated by law in an individual way, but No Child Left Behind gives no provision for that. And anecdotally, teachers that I've spoken to say that No Child Left Behind causes teachers to spend extra time with students who are not keeping up, but they're not allowed to give additional work to students that are keeping up. And so those students are sitting idle in the classroom. And that can dumb down the classroom as a whole, and it removes the challenge of excelling, of really doing well in a class, because you don't have that additional challenge to push you to a higher level. Although it may have been enacted with the best intentions, the No Child Left Behind Act has hindered effective teaching and learning in the classroom more than it has helped it. The Act has not improved the quality of our children's education because it puts the entire responsibility of education on teachers and schools. It rewards schools for teaching to tests rather than achieving competencies, and it requires students to match a one-size-fits-all standard when they may not. In order to provide the best education possible, it's necessary to reform or revoke No Child Left Behind. Teachers need freedom to teach in the way that works for kids, so that kids have the flexibility to learn in the way that works for them. Basing standards on testing alone denies the complexity of education, and it limits the capability of teachers to help children. There are new efforts to relieve, improve, or replace No Child Left Behind, and it's likely going to change in the next couple of years. So go to whitehouse.gov/issues/education and familiarize yourself with these new plans. Educate to Innovate and Race to the Top grants are two opportunities available, and Race to the Top has actually been said to be similar to a lot of programs in other countries that are actually doing very well on global standardized testing. So this is something that could really help our nation improve its education so that we're in the top ranks again. If you find that you agree with those plans, which I think you will, please take the time to call your legislators and write an email or let the White House know that this is something that you want, because right now they need to hear that. So our education depends on changing No Child Left Behind.